Welcome to SCRS Talks, provided by the Society for Clinical Research Sites. Thank you for joining us as we explore the latest insights, trends, and innovations shaping clinical research today. I'm Jimmy Bechtel, the Chief Site Success Officer at SCRS, and I have the pleasure of being joined today by Tyler Van Horn, the CEO of Science 37. Tyler's here today to discuss how Science 37's direct-to-patient site model removes some of those geographic barriers and expands trial reach by bringing research directly to the patient's home. He's going to share a little bit of insight on how this approach helps sponsors access more patients, enroll some of those hard to reach patient populations, reduce no-show rates, and really maintain quality and compliance throughout the study. So before we get into that, Tyler, I'd love for our audience to hear from you and learn a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, Jimmy, thanks for having me. Really excited to be on the podcast today. Happy to give some background around myself and kind of give a high-level overview of Science 37. Name's Tyler Van Horn. I'm CEO here at Science 37. Been in the industry for a number of years. Was in large CROs previous to this and kind of started my career actually in the banking industry, evaluating and looking at biotech and early investments. And so kind of come full circle as an operator and kind of come into this world. Science 37 is an incredibly unique organization. You know, it's had its evolution over the years, but at its core, we are a clinical trial site. We might do things a little bit differently than a traditional clinical trial site as everyone kind of thinks about it. We don't have a clinic. We don't have exam rooms. We don't have a facility other than our headquarters in North Carolina. We bring research directly to the patient, which most of the time means either out of local care facilities, but most of the time out of the patient's home. There's a lot of complexities that we can dig into, how that works and all the mechanics behind it. But we're essentially one site, one set of regulatory documents, but we cover the entire US. So the entire country, we can see a patient wherever they might be.
Excellent, Tyler. Thank you so much for the overview there. And it's always really interesting to be exposed to and talk with the Science 37 team and their really unique take on patient recruitment and clinical trial execution. So let's dive in a little bit more specifically. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the direct-to-patient site and how it's changing and maybe how it's different from the way that normal clinical trials are conducted?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, let's start with how clinical trials are conducted today, and then we can evolve into the direct-to-patient site model and how we're kind of changing the perspective and approach. Typically today, you have your site selected at a given location. Typically, there's a 30-mile radius around that given site that patients are either recruited from or they're coming to that practice for their standard of care. Right now, there's a vast majority of the population that doesn't have access to clinical research, and when you get into the mechanics of it, a site where we are here in North Carolina, people are probably willing to drive further than, say, LA and New York. That geographic radius shrinks considerably. Also, just from a convenience perspective, a lot of protocols and the complexity of clinical trials today increasingly got more complex, but the number of visits has largely increased per trial. And as part of that, that means that any given patient and a participant in a clinical trial has to attend a site more often and either take time out of their day, whether it's work and or if they're a caregiver for a family, to be able to go and actually participate in a clinical trial. Science 37, so we disaggregate the geography from clinical trials. So what does that mean? We are a site where 1/5 set of regulatory documents, all of that is managed centrally. Our investigators have broad licensure. Most of them have 48 to 50 state licenses. Some of them have smaller set of state licenses specifically to like a geography, so coast to coast. We have a team of CRCs that coordinate all of the visits, all the back-end logistics associated with it. We've got a whole logistics team that also supports to be able to ship things to patients' homes. We ship IMP directly to the patient's home. And then we have research-grade nurses, and this is a really important distinction because these are all our employees that are going into the home and being the eyes, hands, and ears of the investigator, while the investigator is providing oversight via telemedicine. And so everything is a fully encapsulated site. The difference is that you can participate in a clinical trial from the comfort of your own living room versus having to commute back and forth to a site. So in that 30-mile example that I gave previously, 30 miles, where I live here in North Carolina could be 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the time of the day. The patient gets that time back. It's more convenient for them to be able to participate, ultimately leading to higher retention rates because we're very flexible with times that we can actually conduct a visit, meaning that we can do weekends and we can do other times as well that are more convenient for the patient. And so being able to fit into their life is really important. And so that's really what we do and how we do it to make sure that anyone and everyone can get access to a clinical trial. An example of this is we have patients enrolled in studies now that are in Montana and South Dakota. And then we have some that are enrolled in more metropolitan areas. It just varies greatly, but we do a lot of visits all over the country on any given day. Ultimately, most of those visits are conducted in what I would call research deserts, so where sites are not.
That's excellent, Tyler. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. It's really interesting to hear not only the similarities, I'm sure we could, and so can the listeners, draw parallel lines to the more quote unquote traditional site experience, but also more importantly, the differences, the augmentations to the traditional site model that enable some of the things that we had mentioned, right? Quality and reaching those patient populations, the convenience of being in one's home and being able to participate in a clinical research study through the enablement of technology and the platform that Science 37 has is really interesting and intriguing way to approach the execution of some of the work that we're doing. And again, meet the particular need of a patient who might not prefer or not be indifferent about, being in person with somebody or having that in-clinic type of experience.
Absolutely. I mean, the day and age that we live in, especially in a post-COVID world where many folks were trapped in their homes for months on end, largely is around convenience. And that extends to the healthcare space as well. The rise and adoption of telemedicine more broadly and the use of that in kind of standard medical practice. It has really kind of driven more adoption and I think more of openness to the approach. And it's really, I don't want to oversimplify it. We're doing a lot of very complex assessments. So we've done 60-hour infusions out of the patient's home. We've done phase 2 Parkinson's trial, UPRS part 3 out of the patient's home. So it extends. We've done spirometry out of the patient's home. It extends much further than just what you would think of a typical home visit. And a lot of these clinical trial visits are incredibly long. A 6-hour visit in a site is a lot of time to spend away from home and your family. And so that convenience is really important to patients.
That's great, Tyler. Let's talk about that concept, right? This new way of thinking and maybe shifting how we've traditionally done things. Because we know that this is probably a new model, or at least a model that hasn't had a lot of exposure for a lot of sponsors. So how do you guide them through the adoption, help them understand what needs to be done there, and really, I guess more importantly, support any shift in design and planning to meet the needs of really enabling this kind of, I guess we'll call it what it is, right? This totally decentralized way of execution.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a very involved process. And there's a lot of engagement with sponsors, either early on in the study design or going through site selection. And a lot of the studies that we come in as well, we're in the middle of the study as the ability to boost enrollment. It largely depends, but a lot of the discussions specifically with sponsors, there are some things that are unique with our model, but 99% of the time, we are just one site of many on any trial that we work on. So if you have 14 sites from the trial, we're the 15th. And so we're fit right into kind of the existing infrastructure that is already there to conduct a clinical trial. There are some nuances and differences. For example, we can't randomize and do baseline or dose on the same day because we have to ship drug to the patient's home. There's some nuances in the way that the trial's set up and the downstream ramifications and impact on that. The other thing is, in a given screening visit, we typically separate out their consent visit and do a telemedicine consent because we don't want to deploy a nurse to the patient's home without a patient actually being interested and willing to participate in the study. Otherwise, you have additional cost associated with it. So we're trying to avoid that on behalf of sponsors. But everything else is going to be largely education around the individual mechanics on how things are done. So for example, we tend to get a lot of questions around RMP accountability and how that's ultimately distributed to patients in a compliant and effective way where there's not a lot of tampering. And so we go through an explaining process end to end on how we use a central pharmacy that has 50 state licensure and ship to patients anywhere. How does the nurse get deployed to the home? What does the experience look like for the patient? What can they expect? How is the data collected? How are the assessments done? A lot of times what we do, especially when a sponsor has particular questions in their medical team in particular, has questions about how our actual visit looks, we will go to the sponsor's place of business, either their headquarters or one of their offices. They'll come to us and we will actually do their clinical trial visit right there with and show them either a screening visit, a day one visit, a dosing visit, or any given visit of their choosing to show what that experience looks like and get them comfortable with how that it is actually being conducted. One of the biggest benefits, at least that we've seen for ourselves in the last 18 to 20 months, is we've been inspected 3 times by the FDA, a handful of pivotal phase 3 trials. And these were all registrational studies, and going through that experience as well, where we had no action indicated. So there was no findings or recommendations from the agency, has provided a lot of credence and frankly, a lot of confidence to sponsors in the model and the data that's actually coming out on the others. And so a lot of engagement on that side. And then as we go through startup, there's also a second round, I guess, of what I would say education, or kind of another way of putting it would be onboarding to the Science 37 kind of model, where, normally the folks that might have selected us as a site aren't always the folks that are going to be executing day to day. We have a pretty clean and consistent process in which we can not only educate the folks that we're engaging with that are looking to stand us up as a site, but also the folks that are going to be day to day, whether it's the CRAs or the individual study teams that are managing the study, to be able to help support them in understanding what we do and how we do it and what the differences are. So when we start enrolling patients into any given study, that they can have a better understanding of what they're ultimately going to see and how things are going to operate.
Those are great examples. I really appreciate the nuance behind all the different ways that you guys approach this with your sponsors to really help them have assurance that this is going to be a great way to execute their clinical trials. But also just that I think it's so important that it's one of those things where it's like, hey guys, we've done this before. We kind of know how this is going to work. And so working in partnership with them to help them, again, design the clinical trials with some of those nuances that you provided in mind, I think is really important. So then shift gears for me, Tyler, and talk a little bit about participation and what that looks like for patients and caregivers. When visits are happening in their home, how do you ensure they receive the same level of support and oversight that you might experience in a traditional on-site visit?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I'll start with the experience. When someone raises their hand and is interested in participating in a trial, they're either going to interact with one of our CRCs or our medical team, or they're going to come through our website and pre-screen for the study. So they can either do it via phone call, or they can do it online as a self-service portal. If they qualify based on the pre-screening questions, going through that and some of their high-level medical history, they're going to release their medical records to us to be able to actually review. It's an incredibly quick experience. We have a really sound operation on that, and it's really important that we're quick with that experience because folks don't like to wait around. Once they go through that, they're going to get scheduled for their telemedicine consent, where our CRCs and our investigators are going to spend time with them, walking them through the informed consent and go through the trial and what the expectations are and risks and benefits and all the things that you would expect from any given site. One of the biggest things that we have found to be incredibly beneficial, as well as that we pride ourselves in, is even at consent or screening or any other study visit, typically our investigators spend between 30 to 50% more time with each one of our participants in the trial and our patients than if you were at a trial site. When you this question around oversight, our investigators are heavily engaged. It's a one-on-one experience. They get to know the patient very intimately, very differently than otherwise you would think, because we're in their home. Their dogs might be there. Family members might be there. We are, when you talk about ComMeds and actually looking at the medications that patients are taking, we can see that they have their medicine cabinet that we can go and ask them questions about. And so we can get a little bit deeper and build more of that relationship there that otherwise wouldn't have been. And so once they've completed, going back to the kind of journey, they complete the consent visit, and then we move into screening and baseline day one visit, dosing visit, and then throughout the rest of the scheduled assessments. But it's a very high touch experience. Every visit is scheduled by our centralized scheduling team. Prior to the visit, our CRCs are in constant contact with the patient, making sure that the INP showed up, that the supplies showed up. We also are tracking all that on the back end, but making sure that they know what to do with those things when they do arrive in their home, where to store them, things of that nature, including all of the supplies that are ultimately shipped out, making sure that they know not to open the box. All has tamper-proof tape, not to open the box, where to put them. Then when they get to the day of the visit, the nurse is traveling to the patient's home. The nurse is going to call the patient the day before, again, go through what to expect. When they're on their way, they're going to call them and say, hey, this is Nurse Jane. I'm 30 minutes away. I'm going to be pulling off in a blue Chevrolet. Start with getting on a telemedicine call with our clinical research coordinator to go over expectations and what we're going to do for the day. And then the nurse sets up their environment where they need to be able to process any samples or things of that nature. But the patient themselves is sitting in their home and they're very comfortable with that experience. As they go through the visit, typically we are consistently, the investigators either coming in and out of the visit and or spending a lot of one-on-one time with that patient. And so it's a very high touch model from end to end. And this happens at every single visit that we ultimately do within our model and every patient that's enrolled. And so we are a little bit more hands-on than you would expect, but it's ultimately yields a better retention rate and ultimately a better satisfactory rate from our patients and the experience from the clinical trial perspective.
That's excellent to hear. And I can imagine where that type of situation would yield that. It seems very intentionally and probably, as you're indicating, valuably so high touch for this audience when, again, we're working through these things where we're in the patient's home, right? It's a little bit nuanced and it's not the typical medical experience that a lot of patients have come to become accustomed to. So providing that level of high support and managing those expectations of the patients and the community and of your staff, it seems very methodical and thought through, which I think is really excellent approach to that. So thanks for breaking that down for us here. So I want to jump into our final question here, Tyler, and talk through a little bit around the process, the operationalization rather, from startup all the way through to monitoring and how you manage staffing and training and getting to the point that we made earlier around maintaining quality and regulatory readiness. I'm kind of circling back to that point you made where you had those 3 recent inspections, which I'm sure you all are an easy target for inspections because it's atypical here, but it's great to hear that you pass those with relatively flying colors. So again, talk to me about how you maintain that quality and keep those studies moving forward and those patients maintained.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're 100% right on the inspections. And we approach quality in a pretty rigorous way across how we're starting up a study, what monitoring looks like, all of those things. The inspections that we've been through have been rigorous, and we've been through 3 of them in a relatively short period of time. And like you mentioned, we're an easy target for 2 reasons. One, we're atypical, like you mentioned. The second is that we're typically the highest enrolling site because of the geographic access that we ultimately can yield and ultimately enroll from. And so much bigger patient population that we ultimately can enroll in the trial and ultimately have access to. But when we come to kind of thinking about operationalizing a trial, our startup is pretty involved because not only we're doing what you would have at a typical clinical trial site, but we're also setting up all the logistics to be able to support the trial. So everything around inventory management, we have a central logistics depot where we are shipping out all the supplies, the study supplies for both the nurses as well as the lab kits and things of that nature, or any devices, the spirometers, ECG machines, things of that nature, scales, whatever it might be. And so we set up all the logistics for that. We have the central pharmacy set up, so that's heavily engaged and involved. And so there's a number of things that kind of have to happen before you can start enrolling patients in any given trial. The rest of the process is rather standardized. Obviously, the things that change trial to trial is the patient population and the nuances there, but also the assessments that you're ultimately performing from trial to trial. So there are nuances to startup, but again, it's a very engaged process with sponsors to help walk them through step by step what's going to happen and what's different. Make sure that everyone's on board and really understands the model itself. We don't have any paper. We have eSource, EISF, all documents are stored there, all data is collected in our eSource. And what that allows for is every person that is on the trial from a staffing perspective can see and access the data in real time and collaborate together in real time for collecting that data for the patient when they're completing the assessments. When someone's onboarded to Science 37, they go through training on our SOPs, but they go on pretty rigorous training on the Science 37 way, which is how we conduct research, what's different, and ultimately what are our expectations and standards for the participants in any given trial, but also from a quality perspective. Then obviously, in any given trial, we go through protocol training and study-specific training for all of the staff, and especially for our research nurses that are going and traveling to the patient's home. There's a number of certifications that they ultimately have to get to be able to transport biospecimens and things of that nature. And so all of those things are taken care of. And so from that perspective, there's a rigorous amount of training that goes on from a study staff perspective, and we maintain all of that in our training records, as you expect any other site to. We also have an internal team where we are not only just relying on sponsors or CROs to monitor us, we are doing asynchronous monitoring visits internally, existing kind of cadence of monitoring visits in the studies at any given point, and whether it's particular milestones, enrollment milestones in the study, or if there's specific triggers or kind of thresholds. We have a team of internal that are looking at data, looking at our EISF, ensuring everything is as expected or as it should be, so that we're approaching those monitoring visits with relative ease, and also that makes it so that we can stay inspection ready at any point in time. We are very proactive from that perspective, which has led to 3 obvious successful outcomes from an FDA inspection perspective, which we're incredibly proud of, because we're the first kind of company in this space to be able to have that not only once but 3 times go through those types of inspections with the FDA. So that's kind of approach, and it's a really proactive approach versus reactive approach to how we maintain quality and how we maintain oversight and things of that nature within our existing kind of model and how we approach everything. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's the high level of how we approach and make sure that we can be consistent trial to trial with maintaining that. And all the folks that we have here, we're very diligent about who we bring on to Science 37, simply because we are different and we want to make sure that we only have the highest standards.
It's an excellent overview, Tyler, and I really appreciate the detail on what arguably is one of the more important components to that. Because if we don't have quality and we don't have the ability to maintain the ethics and the regulatory readiness behind it, then seeing patients can't happen effectively. So it really is foundational, which I appreciate you emphasizing that approach to the way that we do things. It sounds like it really ingrained into the work that you all do. So thank you for that. And, thank you for being here with us today and giving some insights to the industry and what you all are doing and the approach that you all are taking. I think even our more traditional sites probably were able to glean some insights into maybe I should think about doing that, or maybe that's a consideration that I should have as I approach my patient care or my quality at the site level, or the relationship that I have with my sponsor and CRO. So I think everybody listening can probably glean something from the conversation today. So again, thank you for being here with us, and thank you for sharing some more about your organization and the model that you guys use.
I really appreciate you having me on. It was great to talk about all the aspects of it. I'm sure we could have talked for another 2 hours about individual items or dug a little bit deeper, but really appreciate it. And, always looking for different ways to partner with SCRS. It's a great organization, and we're happy to be a member and partner, and looking forward to continuing that journey.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Tyler, thank you so much. And for everyone listening, I hope you make sure to check out other great site-focused resources made available to our entire community on our website, myscrs.org, including other podcasts and webcasts and opportunities to become involved with our partners like Science 37 and many others. Thanks for tuning in, for listening, and until next time.